Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who has definitely forgotten what private property is. I woke up early that day to the sound of my dog, an energetic terrier mix, scratching at the back door to go outside. My property is a modest one, surrounded by a sturdy fence and a gate that opens to a small side street. I built that gate shortly after I purchased the house, mostly because I wanted to have a safe place where my dog could run around without wandering onto busy roads. The surrounding area is relatively quiet, but we do have a homeowner association that likes to enforce certain rules and regulations. I had joined it somewhat reluctantly. It came as part of the package deal when I bought the house. At first, I thought the HOA was harmless enough. Occasional newsletters, a few guidelines about lawn care, rules about not leaving trash cans out all week. Nothing too invasive. Then, over the last year, a new wave of neighbors started moving in, including a certain person named Karen, whose behavior would ultimately propel me into a situation I never expected. That morning, I had a small list of things I wanted to accomplish: a grocery run, some weeding in my front yard, and a few calls regarding an upcoming house project. Before I began my errands, I decided to do something simple: prop my gate open to let in some fresh air and hopefully keep an eye on a friend who was supposed to stop by with a borrowed tool. Normally, I'd keep the gate locked, but I figured if my friend arrived while I was in the yard, it would be more convenient for them to just walk in. My gate is on a hinge that swings inwards, and the lock is a simple metal latch that can be locked or unlocked with a key. I was running back and forth between the front of the house and my side yard, so I took the key from my pocket and set it on the windowsill outside the living room. Why did I do that, you might ask? Because I needed both hands free to carry a few items from the front yard to the backyard. My pockets were already stuffed with my phone, a small notepad with to-do reminders, and the dog's leash. For whatever reason, in that moment, the windowsill felt like a practical temporary spot. I assumed I'd only need a few minutes before returning to move the key elsewhere. The window faces my side yard, which is inside the fence, so I figured it was relatively secure and well out of sight. Little did I know that Karen was lurking nearby, apparently with nothing better to do than watch my every move. She must have spotted me set the key down. While I was hauling some bricks to the backyard, I was working on a small landscaping project, Karen must have swooped in, taken the key, and let herself through the gate. By the time I came back to the window, maybe 4 or 5 minutes later, the key was gone. My heart sank. At first, I thought I might have absent-mindedly slipped it into another pocket or dropped it among the bricks. I retraced my steps and searched in vain, mentally kicking myself for being careless. I was so frustrated with the possibility that I'd lost it right then and there. After a few minutes of frantic searching, I glanced over to my gate and realized, to my horror, that it was now shut and locked. I walked over, tried the latch, and confirmed that indeed, it was locked from the inside. Just as confusion started to morph into real concern, I heard a familiar voice. Looking for something? I turned around, and there was Karen, standing on the inside of my fence, arms folded, wearing the smuggest expression I've seen in a long time. She had my key in one hand and clutched it so tightly that I could see the slight indentation in her palm. The sight of her made my stomach churn with an immediate rush of anxiety and anger. Before I had a chance to speak, she declared, "I saw you leave this out in the open. That's not very responsible. Anyone could have taken it." I struggled to keep my composure. "Karen," I said, forcing a calm tone, "please hand me back the key." She raised an eyebrow, as if she were a teacher scolding a child for misbehavior. "Do you realize you're violating the HOA guidelines by blocking what could be considered a communal path?" Her words struck me as so bizarre that I momentarily forgot how angry I was at her for stealing the key. The path she was referring to was just the side yard that runs around my house, which is my private property, not a communal walkway. Our HOA has no regulation stating that a homeowner must provide open access to their side yards. It's not even a recognized walkway on any official documents. Yet Karen had been complaining for months that she should be able to cut through my property to reach a local park quicker. She had dropped hints in the past, including taped notes to my fence gate, suggesting I was unneighborly for keeping it locked. I usually just ignored these notes, because I knew there was no rule requiring me to leave my gate unlocked. In fact, the HOA usually encourages secure fences and gates. At that moment, she went a step further. "This property is subject to the HOA's guidelines," she insisted, brandishing the key as if it were a piece of evidence. "By having a locked gate, you're making it impossible for neighbors to walk through. I reminded her that the gate is on my land, not a shared space, and that there's no official rule granting neighbors a right to cross it. She scoffed and pointed out that in some communities, pathways can be used by others if they're designated as easements. I pointed out that there is no such easement on my deed. I've read every page of my home's documents, and nowhere does it say that I must keep my fence open. Karen didn't care. She announced, "I'm not leaving until you sign a written promise that you'll keep this gate unlocked anytime I want to walk through. It's an HOA rule, and I have every right." Now, I don't know if she was referencing some rule from decades ago or perhaps something completely unrelated, but I was certain that her claims were baseless. I tried to reason with her, but she stomped her foot, locked the gate from the inside, and then stepped away from me toward my backyard. "Hey!" I shouted. "You can't just walk back there." She shrugged, glared at me, and said, "Yes, I can. If you don't like it, take it up with the HOA board. I'm staying until you guarantee I can walk here anytime I please." At that point, I realized that just reasoning with her in that moment wasn't going to work. She'd become too wrapped up in this sense of entitlement. My friend, who had been scheduled to drop by, arrived right then, seeing me on one side of the fence, Karen on the other, and the gate firmly locked. My friend asked, "What's going on?" I explained, doing my best not to lose my cool. Meanwhile, Karen just eyed the friend suspiciously. She had planted herself in my yard near a small patch of tomato plants I had cultivated. I couldn't believe how quickly the situation escalated. She was literally trespassing, and she refused to budge unless I gave in to her demands. My friend stepped to the side, quietly asking if we should call the police. I hesitated because calling the police on a neighbor is never a pleasant thought. But as soon as I tried to speak to Karen again, she became belligerent, going on about how it was her right to have a free and unobstructed path. She even threatened to lodge a formal complaint, claiming I violated the rules by not letting her roam at will. I knew that her threats were mostly hot air, but at the same time, she was physically in my yard, had locked me out of my own gate, and refused to return the key. Enough was enough. I calmly but firmly told her I was calling the authorities. She scoffed and yelled out, "Go ahead, call them. I'll tell them you stole my key, or that you're holding me hostage, or something else that'll get you in trouble." Hearing that twisted threat of making a false report did it for me. My friend was already dialing the non-emergency number for the police, explaining the situation. As we waited for an officer, Karen actually sat on my patio chair, as if she were settling in for a long standoff. She glared daggers at us through the fence and repeated that this was her right. My dog, who was inside the house, started barking, confused about who was in the yard. I felt a mixture of fury, anxiety, and total disbelief. Nothing about her actions made the slightest bit of sense, but her sense of entitlement was unwavering. Before the police arrived, I texted a neighbor, Patrice, who'd had her own run-ins with Karen. Patrice once told me that Karen repeatedly complained about the color of her porch furniture, saying it clashed with the HOA's guidelines, which, by the way, had no mention of furniture color at all. Patrice wrote back that she and her husband had to threaten legal action just to get Karen to stop harassing them. They ended up documenting every petty complaint. Patrice offered to come over to serve as a witness if I needed her to. I thanked her, but told her to hold off for the moment, because the police were already on their way. She texted back, "Good luck, don't let her push you around." Within about 15 minutes, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers got out, approached my gate, and saw me pacing on the outside. One of them asked, "Sir, can you explain what's happening?" I let them know that my neighbor had taken my key from my windowsill, locked herself inside my property, and was refusing to leave. In the background, Karen started shouting, "He's lying. That's actually my key. He tried to lock me in here." The whole thing was as absurd as it sounds, but the officers had to approach it methodically. They asked if anyone was in physical danger or if there were any weapons. I said no, just a stolen key and an intruder who wouldn't leave. One officer asked Karen to approach the fence and speak. She rattled off some convoluted story about how the homeowner association had given her permission to be there. She claimed I was violating the HOA's regulations by preventing her from exercising her walking rights, whatever that was supposed to mean. I tried to keep a straight face, but the officer's puzzled look told me he wasn't buying any of it. He then requested that she produce any documentation that authorized her to remain in my enclosed property. Karen, of course, had nothing. She said that the HOA had verbal guidelines, so there was nothing in writing. The officer calmly explained that absent any proper documentation, she was trespassing. Furthermore, he added, even if the HOA said she could stand there, hypothetically, My private property rights typically override such a claim unless there's a legal easement. Karen insisted it was an easement, but once again provided no proof. At that point, the second officer told her, "Ma'am, please return the key, step out of the property, and hand it to the rightful owner." Karen remained obstinate, crossing her arms and stating, "I'm not leaving until I have a guarantee." The officers exchanged a look, and I could see they were tired of dealing with that attitude. They gave her one more chance. "You need to return the key and vacate the premises immediately, or we will have to arrest you for trespassing." Rather than comply, she started saying something to the effect of, "This is illegal. You can't arrest me for standing in my own walkway." She just wouldn't accept reality. That's when the officer informed her that she was going to be arrested. The officer opened the gate using a spare key I happened to keep hidden elsewhere. Thankfully, I had a second backup, just never used it often because it sticks a bit. As soon as he stepped into my yard, Karen started protesting, demanding to speak to a supervisor, threatening to take this to the highest level to fix the so-called injustice. Her voice escalated, but the officer calmly instructed her to put her hands behind her back. She wouldn't comply. With some caution and repeated instructions, they eventually got her to stop flailing. She was cuffed and led out to the patrol car. Meanwhile, I stood there, wide-eyed, feeling a rush of relief mixed with the surreal sense that this was actually happening in my yard. After they escorted her out, the officer handed me the key, which Karen had finally let go of, albeit reluctantly. Then the officers asked if I wanted to press charges for trespassing and theft. I hesitated because the notion of pressing charges against a neighbor is pretty heavy, but given the situation, her repeated harassment, her refusal to leave, her theft of my property, it felt like I didn't have many options left to protect myself. I told them yes, I did want to press charges, as I believed her behavior wasn't going to improve unless there were serious consequences. The officer said, "Understood," and added that it was wise to speak to the HOA directly about what happened. Karen was driven off in the patrol car. Watching it pull away, I felt an odd mix of triumph and disbelief. My friend, who had stood by me the entire time, gave me a pat on the shoulder and said, "That was wild. I can't believe how far she took this." I just nodded, thanking him for having my back. Once the police left, I locked the gate properly, key in hand, and just stood there for a moment to breathe. My dog peeked through the living room window, clearly sensing that something unusual had happened. A couple of hours later, I reached out to the HOA to let them know I had filed a police report about Karen trespassing. I was expecting them to either feign ignorance or try to distance themselves from the matter. Instead, one of the board members told me that they had received numerous complaints about Karen's behavior. Evidently, she had made a hobby out of pestering neighbors regarding minor or entirely fabricated infractions. She would rifle through the HOA's guidelines, find anything that looked vaguely like a rule, and then interpret it in the most absurd way possible to justify complaining. The board member apologized for the trouble I'd experienced and assured me that the HOA did not require me to keep my gate unlocked. In fact, they encouraged me to keep it secure because safety was a high priority. It turns out Karen had already been warned about harassing other neighbors, and they were in the process of determining whether to fine her for repeated violations of neighborly conduct. The board member indicated that with this latest fiasco, her arrest for trespassing, they would expedite any disciplinary measures in their power. That news brought a little relief. I hoped that she would face a serious penalty from the HOA in addition to the legal repercussions, enough to dissuade her from causing more trouble in the future. Over the following days, I started hearing from neighbors about how Karen had targeted them as well. One neighbor, Tim, told me she once demanded that he cut down his hedges because they were supposedly blocking the neighborhood's natural airflow. Another neighbor, Sheila, confided that Karen threatened to report her to the HOA for letting her granddaughter use sidewalk chalk on the driveway, claiming it was defacing community property. The stories piled up, painting a clear picture of someone who relished drama and control. About a week after the incident, I got a letter from Karen's lawyer. Actually, it was just a notice on legal stationery, claiming I was in breach of the HOA guidelines. The letter cited some vaguely worded portion about common pathways that didn't even exist in our neighborhood, and insisted I must allow Karen access through my yard or face a civil lawsuit. I immediately forwarded this to my own attorney. It didn't take him long to confirm what I already suspected. There was no legal standing to her claim. My attorney drafted a response, pointing out that the property in question was entirely enclosed within my lot lines. that there was no established easement or any communal right-of-way, and that I would countersue for harassment if they continued to press the matter. That effectively ended the threat of a civil suit from Karen's side, at least for the time being. Meanwhile, the criminal trespassing case proceeded. A local prosecutor took up the charges. Given that Karen had physically taken my key from my windowsill without permission and then refused to leave, the evidence was pretty cut and dry. There was a hearing set for a few weeks later, which I attended. Karen showed up with a different lawyer, looking furious. She refused to acknowledge me, but I could feel her glare whenever my back was turned. During the hearing, the judge asked whether she understood the charges. She started going off on a tangent about HOA rules and private walkways, but the judge was quick to note that none of that negated the fact that she was on someone else's property without permission. The judge also pointed out that if there was a legitimate legal claim, she should have gone through the courts to establish an easement rather than taking matters into her own hands. Karen responded with an exasperated sigh. I truly think she believed the judge would side with her. In the end, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to move forward with a trial if the prosecutor wished, but allowed for a plea offer if Karen wanted to avoid a jury trial. Karen's lawyer seemed to advise her to take a deal. Ultimately, she ended up pleading guilty to a lesser charge, something along the lines of misdemeanor trespassing, and was sentenced to community service and a small fine. The judge also issued a restraining order requiring Karen to stay a certain distance from me and to not set foot on my property under any circumstances. If she violated that order, she could face further legal action or even jail time. Once that was over, I thought the saga would finally end. I started making improvements to my fence. I put up a taller barrier, changed the latch, and installed a new digital lock that doesn't rely on a key alone. My dog seemed a bit unsettled for a while, probably sensing the tension from the incident. But eventually we settled back into a normal routine. Neighbors congratulated me for standing up for my rights. Some told me they were relieved that Karen had finally faced consequences for her behavior. And for about 2 weeks, it seemed quiet. Then one afternoon, I noticed a white envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a typed letter from Karen, with no formal apology. Instead, she wrote that I was punishing her for trying to uphold neighborhood values. She repeated her mantra that I was blocking a public path, something that, again, had zero legal basis. She also claimed that I was making her the villain when she was just trying to do the right thing. The letter ended with an ominous statement. I'll be watching to make sure you follow all of the HOA rules from now on. I took that note straight to the HOA board. They seemed exasperated, saying they'd already had multiple discussions about revoking her membership privileges. Although you can't simply expel someone from an HOA if they own property in the community, the board can revoke certain amenities or even impose repeated fines for nuisance behavior. Sure enough, just a few days later, the HOA board sent out a notice to everyone regarding neighborly courtesy and property rights. It didn't name Karen specifically, but it was clearly a response to all her shenanigans. The notice reminded residents that personal property lines are to be respected, no one has the right to trespass, and that legitimate concerns about rule violations should be directed to the board, not handled by individuals. While that might not sound like a huge consequence, it was a big step for our usually timid HOA to directly address the problem. As for Karen, word got around that she had accumulated several $100s in fines. I heard rumors that she was furious about it and that she tried to challenge the fines on the grounds that the board was biased. However, every neighbor who had been confronted by her, Patrice, Tim, Sheila, and several others, testified about how Karen consistently targeted them with false accusations. The board was no longer sympathetic. In fact, they were eager to quell the negativity she brought to the neighborhood. Eventually, Karen's fines grew to the point where, if left unpaid, the HOA would have the option to place a lien on her property. Whether that will actually happen, I can't be sure, but the possibility alone highlights how serious this became. Around this same time, Patrice confided to me that Karen had started making more subtle threats. For instance, after Karen lost at the hearing, she allegedly told Patrice, "Just wait, I'll find a reason to get you in trouble next," referencing some fabricated violation of neighborhood decor standards. Patrice was wise enough to ignore these jabs, but she kept a record of every text message and note, just in case. Patrice and I, along with a few other homeowners, began organizing a small supportive network where we'd communicate about any further incidents with Karen. If she tried to harass one of us, we'd let the others know. This was meant not as a way to gang up on her, but to ensure we all had each other's backs in case she pulled any more stunts that crossed the line into trespassing or theft of property. My biggest concern for a while was that Karen would try to come onto my property again, maybe late at night or when I was at work. That fear prompted me to install a simple camera system around my house. I placed cameras near the front door, the side gate, and the backyard entrance, each triggered by motion. I was pretty sure that she wouldn't dare trespass again, given the restraining order, but the last thing I wanted was another surprise encounter. The camera system gave me some peace of mind. And, for the most part, life did go back to normal. In the following weeks, I saw Karen occasionally. If I happened to be driving home and she was out walking, I might spot her glaring in my direction. She never tried to approach me physically, as far as I could tell. I think the legal repercussions and the HOA fines were enough to keep her from doing something outrageous, at least publicly. However, she posted odd rants on the community's online bulletin board, accusing certain neighbors of corruption and theft of her rights. Most people in the neighborhood ignored her or posted replies clarifying that her claims had no basis. It got to the point where the moderator of the board had to remove some of Karen's posts because they were verging on harassment. I saw a screenshot or two of these rants, and it was basically Karen's attempt at rewriting history, claiming that I had locked her in, that I was shutting off the side path to harm her, and that the police had been tricked into arresting her. I didn't bother engaging with her online. There was no point in feeding the drama. What's somewhat surprising is that Karen hasn't moved away. Several neighbors speculated that she might sell her house and leave after being humiliated by the arrest. But apparently, she's still here. I can only guess that she doesn't want to uproot her life or concede defeat. Maybe she's too stubborn to back down. Either way, it seems like she's lying low for now. With the restraining order in place, she can't show up at my property without risking another arrest. She may continue to grumble about the lost walkway, but we all know it never existed in any official capacity. As for the HOA, they've taken a more active role in addressing petty complaints from members. I think they realized that letting someone like Karen run wild with misinterpretations of the guidelines was a recipe for disaster. One side plot that emerged from this drama is that a few of the neighbors, who originally disliked HOAs in general, found themselves somewhat grateful for the HOA's stance. Had we not had an organized body that could collectively respond to her antics, each of us might have had to deal with her nonsense one by one. However, with the HOA stepping in to issue fines and policy clarifications, it put a spotlight on Karen's pattern of harassment. Patrice, in particular, said that while she still rolls her eyes at some of the association's more trivial guidelines, she's now relieved that we have a centralized place to escalate serious disputes. Tim, too, said he used to ignore all HOA emails, but after seeing how they backed us up, he's more willing to participate in their meetings to help ensure neighbors like Karen can't misrepresent the rules. Also, in the aftermath, I learned something interesting about the property lines in our neighborhood. When I first moved in, I received a map showing the boundaries of each lot, but I never looked too deeply into it beyond confirming the fence line. After Karen's fiasco, I decided to double-check everything, just to ensure no easement existed. I went through public records, old deeds, and even some older neighborhood association documents from decades ago. Nothing suggested a single shared walkway in my side yard. If Karen had done the same due diligence, she would have learned that my yard is clearly marked as private property with no access easements. That said, it was oddly educational. I discovered a few interesting facts about how the neighborhood was developed, including that certain blocks do have public footpaths running behind them, but not on my street. So her entire argument about common pathways might have been confused with one of those other blocks. Or maybe she saw something about that older system and decided to apply it to my lot without verifying. To add another dimension to this story, I had a chat with a longtime resident, Mildred, who's in her 70s and has lived here for decades. She recalled a neighbor who was similarly troublesome back in the 1980s. That neighbor tried to claim that the land behind their house was communal property, attempting to build a shed halfway into someone else's lot. That neighbor ended up in court and lost as well. Mildred laughed about how history seems to repeat itself, though in her opinion, Karen's behavior was more brazen. Apparently, not many folks in our neighborhood's history had gone as far as stealing a key and locking themselves inside someone else's fence. My day-to-day life has mostly returned to peace, though I admit I'm more cautious now. If I need to step away from the gate or the house, I keep my keys in my pocket or in a locked box. I never leave them out in the open, not even on the inside windowsill for a minute. Karen's bizarre sense of entitlement taught me that certain people will seize any opportunity to assert control. In a way, I've become more protective of my personal space. It's unfortunate that I can't fully trust some of my neighbors, but that's the reality. Not everyone respects boundaries, and it's better to be safe than to learn the hard way that you've let your guard down in front of someone determined to exploit any weakness. One interesting outcome is that my friend who witnessed the incident, the same one who was coming by to drop off a borrowed tool that day, has become a closer confidant. We laugh about the absurdity of it all, and sometimes he jokes that we should write a book about it. But we've made something good come from the fiasco. We started a weekend neighborhood watch rotation with a few other folks. It's nothing overly formal, just a casual agreement that at least one neighbor will be on the lookout in the evenings, walking around, making sure everything is calm. We share updates by text if we see something odd. Oddly enough, it's brought the neighbors closer together. Patrice says she's gotten to know more people in the last few months than she had in the 5 years prior. In a final twist, the local rumor mill says that Karen's facing serious financial strain because of the legal fees and the fines. Some neighbors claim she's begun listing a few personal belongings for sale to pay off some of the debts. I can't confirm that, but I do know she's missing out on certain HOA privileges, like the community pool and the clubhouse, until she settles her outstanding fines. Whether that will be enough to make her back down, I can't say. She might see herself as a martyr for some imagined cause. Maybe in a year or two she'll move away and leave everyone in peace. Maybe she'll keep raging about her walkway forever. All I know is, at the end of the day, the law is the law, and it's on the side of property owners who have every right to lock their own gates. Friends, thank you. See you soon.